These are dead genres, dead voices. So my operative question in my mind is, how do we recover those voices?
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning. I'm a classicist at Brown University, and this semester I'm excited to be teaching a new graduate seminar on Xenophon. The seminar is going to be looking at how Xenophon engaged with other thinkers and authors of his lifetime, so in particular Thucydides, Plato, and Isocrates. It's basically a grad seminar in early 4th century Athenian prose, so I've appropriated the title of one of my own favorite podcasts, Anthony Caldelis's Byzantium and Friends, to make it sound a little more interesting. So my seminar is called Xenophon and Friends. We start up next week, and I'll let you know how it goes. The first time I went to the SCS, or the APA as it used to be known back then, was 21 years ago, in 2004. One of the panels I went to, and the only one I actually remember going to, was a panel called Greece, Ancient and Modern. My guest for this episode, Andromache Karanika, was one of the speakers. And it's been funny to look back at the old program and panel description and think about how far the fields of classics and modern Greek studies have come since then. So the stated purpose of this panel, which was the first to put ancient and modern Greek side by side at the meetings, was to, quote, present more concrete examples of how ancient and modern Greek literature and culture interact, how each one of them becomes more intelligible in terms of the other, and how they can be productively compared in academic discourse. The intersection between classics and modern Greek studies has, I would argue, gotten both more sophisticated and more complicated since then. But it's amazing to me that just 20 years ago, a case that classics should pay some attention to modern Greek and modern Greek studies still needed to be made. For her very memorable paper on the panel, Andromache presented on an early version of her research into ancient Greek women's song. The conversation that you'll be hearing between us today is about the second monograph of hers to have arisen from that large-scale project. Her recent book, Wedding, Gender, and Performance in Ancient Greece, searches, with some incredibly practical, concrete results, for vestiges of wedding poetics in early Greek literature, especially in Homer and in the Homeric hymns. But following in the footsteps of Margaret Alexiou, whose groundbreaking work on Lament set the ancient and modern Greek folk traditions side by side, Andromache, who herself has experience as an ethnologist working in the modern Greek oral tradition, brings a remarkable sensitivity to the ancient texts that is the result of that training precisely in the folk tradition. Alexiou's The Ritual Lament in Greek Tradition, by the way, was first published exactly 50 years ago this year. This is a really fun episode. I think we cover a lot of ground, from the Iliad to Sappho to children's games as attested by Pollux and vase painting. I hope you enjoy it. Andromache Karanika is professor of classics at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Voices at Work, Women, Performance, and Labor in Ancient Greece, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2014, and her latest book, Wedding, Gender, and Performance in Ancient Greece, which was published with Oxford University Press very recently. She's co-editor of Emotional Trauma in Greece and Rome, Representations and Reactions, and that she edited with Lily Panussi in 2020. She served as editor of TAPA from 2018 to 2021, and she was the 2023 to 2024 president of CAMWIS. Just a quick reminder that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes. And also a little reminder that by rating and writing a review for the podcast, you'll help more listeners to find us. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Andromache Karanika. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
This project started a long time ago as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my dissertation back in my graduate years. And in fact, it came from a failure. I originally had a prospectus that wanted to explore all the women's songs in general, kind of a very general, not work, not wedding songs. So there was a laundry list in there. And of course, the wedding songs and the work songs were part of it. But I wanted to do a sort of a bigger project on women's sort of speech. It was somehow a little bit too ambitious as a project, and also it wasn't very clearly presented, and it failed, luckily. And so out of that laundry list came the first project, the work song. But as I was working on that, I realized that I was too focused on song. And this was when the idea of voices and performance came, and I looked into the theory behind, and that kind of made me realize that what I wanted to do was to see how were women present in shaping literature as we have it. So that made me rethink the whole sort of, we talk about oral tradition, then, I'm not making any claims for female authorship. I'm careful not to do that. But if we talk about oral tradition, then women are shapers of this oral tradition in different ways. So then I started thinking somewhat archaeologically. I'm not an archaeologist, but I started thinking, okay, we have like bits and pieces. And if we have epic, I was thinking primarily with epic, if epic poetry is a kind of, let's say, a depository of different genres, how do they pop up? How can we understand, how it came to being? And then that's how I started looking at the work theme and how it is present. And that was the sort of my first book. But somewhere there, I think the nuptial was kind of in its dormant stage. It was very clearly that there were intersections. Of course, the other big genre is lament, and a lot of interest has been shown on. There's a lot of work, a lot of research on lament, and it's more research. So I wanted to I left that untouched at the time because, there's so much that has been done from Alexiou's ritual lament and early on. And in a way, this was the thing that opened up sort of the whole oral tradition and the women's participation in it. So I kind of started thinking earlier that wedding was almost like the opposite of lament. And it's interesting because they're so twisted as genres. They can stand both as opposites, but yet they are so similar in so many ways. And this is something that many scholars have noted for too long. And then because I was thinking archaeologically, I thought, okay, there's something. I think I even mentioned it somewhere in the book. There is I call it like a necropolis syndrome. Just as, you become an archaeologist because you first look at cemeteries and you look at kind of dead people. And in my view, okay, these are dead genres, dead voices that we can never recover. So the question, my operative question in my mind is like, how do we get to, I don't want to say necessarily reconstruct, even though I often use this word, but it's how do I recover those voices and how have they entered, especially for epic, which was my primary focus, how have they shaped it? So for the last few years, I started thinking more about the nuptial theme, the wedding plot, so to speak. But also I looked at it not just as a separate sort of theme or plot, or a scene, let's say a wedding scene, and there's certainly plenty of those. But I was more interested in how it kind of got into the epic verse, how, whatever was uttered at the time became, had a kind of a power of genesis, of transforming itself into a different way. So there's this entanglement. And, I think all the work that has been done on lament helped me rethink how lament has shaped work songs and even more wedding songs.
Maybe you could say a little bit about the corpus of sources that you are using from the book. So, just to be clear for people, right, there isn't some secret repository of, a whole anthology of ancient wedding songs.
Yeah.
Right? But you're working, and maybe you could also speak then both about the corpus that you're using for evidence, but also some of the methodological concepts and terminology that you use that carry over from the book on the work songs, like these notions of intextualization or the hypergenre.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wish there was a secret depository that we could get ourselves to, but unfortunately there isn't. So it's a lot of the well-known literature. So I start primarily with Homer, and it's both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm more interested in moments in Homer where women are present. I think these have been my primary focus. So just to be more exact here, so Odyssey 6 is like a paradise. The meeting between Odysseus and Nausicaa, which in my first book I kind of saw more the work sort of environment behind. I mean, they were doing some kind of laundry, let's say, in to put it in modern terms. And I thought about that scene quite a bit. I think this has been like a leading scene in my mind, and it also speaks for my methodology, because I've thought of this scene very in a way sort of. I mean, we live in a world that doesn't give us all the. I mean, when we think of the washing of the clothes, it's kind of a task you do at home alone. But I know it was not the case, in antiquity, and it was not until very recent in many places around the world. It could have involved a network of women. And I think what sparked my interest is that as a child, I had seen the washing of the winter blankets in my village up in the mountains of Greece in Pindos, that, women would gather together. It would be a sort of a celebratory sort of thing. It would be a ritual essentially. And of course, that moment of waiting for the clothes to dry, that gives you kind of, an opening it gives you time. So you leave them, and then you can have 1, 2, 3 days until the clothes dry. And it's a whole anthropology of all things that are going in there, from song, from dance, from jokes, from gossip. I mean, you name it.
Tossing a ball around.
And that's exactly what is going on behind Odyssey 6. And it is I'm trying to think what we don't have in the epic, but it's very interestingly right in front of us. We kind of miss it just by seeing it. So if you look at it from the right perspective, it's there. So that was for my first book, but now this scene keeps sort of haunting me in Odyssey 6, precisely because, the whole the explanation that Nausicaa gave to her father that she wanted to go out is that, there's a wedding. And it is, she kind of says, it's a wedding. It's for my brothers, so she's kind of ashamed. She's kind of embarrassed, and she's trying to, so there's an interesting nuptial context in there. And of course, Athena had put her in her mind that it is her own wedding. So multiple weddings are there. So I started rethinking that. And rethinking that, then I looked at all the nuptial elements that are there. So to continue on other texts, of course, Iliad 3 in particular, and the Teikhoskopeia, and then all this kind of rather sort of fossilized language of, when Priam asks Helen, and this is an odd moment in the Iliad, that there's 10 years at war. So the plot is there in my mind. Why doesn't he know who his enemies are? Of course he does. There are all these logical problems when reading the Iliad. But when you see that, there is a different tradition, possibly, from the cyclical tradition of Helen and her suitors, that has entered and shaped that scene. But also the way they talk about how makarismos is used, how you kind of praise the hero that she's seeing, that points to the nuptial element.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, actually, could you maybe walk us through your nuptial interpretation of the Teikhoskopeia? Because that was really striking for me. I had never thought about it. I found your argument totally convincing. So maybe you could just explain to listeners a little bit of what you see. You talk at the beginning about the ikasia and the makarismos, and, you know, what elements of nuptial language or thematics are there?
Yeah, so on one hand, you have the ikasia that someone looks like somebody else. Okay, so it's a kind of a simile in a way. And on the other hand, you have the makarismos, a kind of a blessing, but also everything has to appear grand, you know, much, much, much grander. So in a way, it's above. It's a great sort of scale of presenting the hero. So you have there, I mean, she's being asked about Agamemnon in Iliad 3, and then the way she's being asked is like, give me the name of this huge man. Okay, so it's Andrapelorion, which is an interesting sort of, it has interesting connotations in the epic context. The Achaean man who is so powerful and tall. And of course, there are others who may be a head taller, but my eyes have never seen yet a man so handsome or so royal. He looks, and this is the part that I think is kind of really revealing, Basilei gar Andri eoike. So he looks like a king. So, and we have this eoike. So the eikasia, it kind of it kind of speaks for itself, you know, that everything has to seem like something.
And of course, Helen herself is in the Trojan Elder saying she seems like a goddess.
Exactly. So it's everything has to seem like someone else. So this is the eikasia element. And so these, I think there's also an almost psychological element. We have a kind of a restoration of the bride here. So there's on one hand that the diction is nuptial, but at the same time, you know, Helen is restoring her own identity as a kind of a bride. I mean, she's always been a kind of a bride. She's always been a foreign bride. And this sort of scene kind of really underscores that.
Yeah, none of this had occurred to me at all, but just hearing you even just read those lines that Helen says, I mean, it sounds like a modern Greek folk tradition, the makarismos that you were doing, but just sort of shifting your paradigm and listening for that. I mean, it just sounds like it could come from the page of some compendium of, you know, modern Greek folk song or something.
And then, of course, going away from the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Homeric hymns also have a strong sort of nuptial element. And my three, let's say, favorite are the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And I think this is such, I mean, this is a performance about death as it is about a wedding at the same time. But it also is so much about the problematization of what this wedding or what this death was, or how death appears as a wedding and wedding appears as death. And then, of course, the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite and the shorter Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, the sixth one, which again has a lot of these elements of the makarismos and eikasia throughout. Then moving away from the epic world, I think Sappho is really giving us the finest sort of vestiges of what we can call, I mean, I kind of say authentic, quote unquote, but, you know, real wedding songs, and very different from what we get in the epic world. So things like, you know, in Sappho fragment 111, 110, you know, there's, or fragment 114, the sort of virginity little fragment. I think these are all little sort of glimpses of actual wedding songs, which would have been performed in one way or the other. And then moving forward, there's nuptial elements, of course, in tragedy. I mean, Richard Seaford has discussed that, and it's very twisted. I mean, tragedy and, drama in general, but tragedy and comedy definitely present sort of wedding diction, let's say, and performances in different ways. And And then going away from, let's say, the classical period, of course, there's Theocritus 18 with the so-called Epithalamion, who also brings sort of a wedding tradition, but also, of course, it's a Hellenistic rendering. It's a very erudite rendering. But I think I kind of envision that Theocritus had an interest in folklore in his own way, and sort of. He has an interest in ritual, and his encyclopedic sort of knowledge helps him sort of put that in poetry. And then moving away from that, I think Irina has been very important in my mind. Irina is the most difficult sort of piece of poetry. I think I've spent, maybe years just reading again and again. And the reason is because it's so fragmentary. It's part of a longer hexametrical poem. There's a lot of difficulties, and I think Irina is a kind of mirroring Sappho, but also has absorbed a lot of the poetic practices there. It's not clear what her poem is. The distaff, we're not sure what, there are people who argue that it's a lament. I'm not sure. I actually agree with Olga Levaniuk, who sees this as part of a special kind of lamentation, sort of, but in a wedding context. So there's lots of questions about Irina. And then moving forward, Daphnis and Longus' Daphnis and Chloe also have a moment. So little bits and pieces that present sort of voices. I think my sort of operative word is voices about wedding that can help us understand and can help us go deeper and see how that really shows the experience at the end of the day to the extent that we can. Yeah.
I found this account, this was on page 8 of the introduction, really helpful, where you say the textual elements I focus on in this book are small parts of complex social interactions. As those distinct oral products are lifted from their social context, the intextualization process makes them part of another textual tradition, which itself is part of ever-changing social interactions between performers and audiences. Nevertheless, recontextualization, when oral texts become integral parts of a different, often larger genre, acknowledges the originary context of production and even retains these interactional residues. So there you italicize intextualization, recontextualization, and interactional residues as terms of art that I think are guiding your methodology. I found that very helpful.
If one thinks of, for example, the salutation, okay? So when we have a lot of especially in the Homeric hymns, you have like Haire, Anasa, in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Or similarly, when Odysseus sees Nausicaa in Odyssey 6 and says, Gunume se anasa, okay, I clasp your knees, my queen, okay. So these are moments that, this kind of salutation could be part of a wedding sort of performance, of a greater wedding performance. But then how does it appear within a different context, within a different narrative that has specific needs? And of course, Odysseus, in the Odyssey, there are very, very clear needs. And there's a narrative plot, there's a narrative arch. So something that could be on its own, could have a life on its own. And I imagine there would be some kind of salutations, just as there would be, the makarismoi or the pronouncing someone, oh, blessed be our, oh, you're so like, and this is very a classic sort of aspect of the wedding sort of repertoire. Now, such little elements have entered sort of the greater sort of epic poem, and they kind of they're like little vestiges of, what would be in a different context. They would stand on their own in a different context.
Yeah, you talk about the hyper genre too. So mostly of epic, right? That is kind of gobbling up these other forms and repurposing them. I like how you said, adapting it to its own purposes, like in the case of the Teikhoskopeia, which you were just speaking about. Well, could you also just say a quick word maybe about the iconographic evidence that you use? Because you do discuss several vase paintings, which seem to add a lot that is of interest. So how are you bringing the material evidence in?
I mean, the material evidence was not like my primary focus. I mean, this is work that has been done very, very nicely by Joan Oakley and Rebecca Sinos. So they've discussed also we have so many wedding scenes, especially in the classical times, but they have helped me look back at poetry and visualize it. But they have also helped me see at what kind of patterns we have, but especially when talking about a bride. I mean, even today, there's all this iconic sort of element. You know, it's kind of like taking a photograph. You have pictures of a bride or the bridal preparations. And this has been so much present in the archaeological record that I think I've used this as a way to make me think or to make me poke into literature to see sort of the anthropology and to see the presence of multiple women together, the network of women sort of interacting. And I mean, if you think of how a wedding would take place, there would be the proavlia, there would be the actual gamos, the procession, and there would be then the epaulia with the gifts and everything. So everything it involves a lot of people. So, and in these people, the bride, I think, is the one that stands out. In a way, this hasn't changed like we think a lot of weddings today, so to speak. So thinking with visual scenes has helped me poke into literature in ways that I don't think I could have done with that, if I didn't have them.
Yeah, you make the really interesting point that, and then of course it strikes one as obvious, but if you didn't think of it before, it is arresting that this is a culture without marriage certificates and without priests who can perform wedding ceremonies in the modern sense of the word, so that then you can't have Romeo and Juliet running and eloping in the dark of night with one single priest to marry them. It has to be a public thing for it to be real. It really relies upon public acknowledgement, much as in a time without boundary maps, right? That, possession of property relies on the attestation of and recognition of neighbors that that's the property that you own. So I thought that was a really interesting point, just how public and social these occasions needed to be.
We have an interesting disjunction there because at the same time it is a family affair, but it is also a public affair. And it's not very clear to what extent it remains a family affair and to what extent it is the bigger polis participates. But I think it's important to see that it is we have a movement, there is a procession, and we have a movement from one sort of space to another space, and that is central. And I think this is what the archaeological, especially the archaic archaeological sources, capture to a great extent. Sort of the bigger movement and a lot of people. And then when you have a poem like Sappho's 44, I kind of see that as a counterpart, as the poetic counterpart of what we see in an archaic vase.
So on the wedding of Hector and Andromache.
Exactly, yeah. And this is a moment that we don't, it's a part of the, let's say, the epic world that does not exist in epic. So we have Sappho's rendering of it. And it really is, it's a great depository of the many different types of performance, of the paeans, of the ululations, of the gestures, of the materiality, of the gifts, that not everything is enumerated, but what we have there's a reference to the gifts. So the gifts means that somebody would bring them. So there's a lot of people behind, and just as there are a lot of things. So reading that together with the scene in archaic pottery sort of makes me see, okay, this is something very intense that is going on. It involves a lot of people.
Well, your mention of Sappho 44 also brings me to ask you about this rubric of the senses that you used to organize the first major chapter. Could you speak a little bit about why you found the senses as a helpful entry point into thinking about all of this?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because I think I had so much difficulty in trying to see how do I organize this material, especially because we have so many different texts. And I started again, it kind of the thinking archaeologically kind of helped me, because I felt, okay, if what we see in an object involves sort of this, okay, I see it, but then the object had something in there, so there was more, so there was something that I could taste. So the senses kind of came by thinking archaeologically again, that this was a very much sort of a lived experience. And sort of archaeologically, I was thinking archaeologically and anthropologically at the same time. And that made me sort of think that what is the dominant sort of sense in different scenes. And by looking at that, it felt that I could bring it alive, so to speak, and I could bring them together. And so that's how I kind of decided that I'm going to do these sort of, it helps us show that that ancient Greek poetry, both epic and lyric, was, I'm going to use the word sensual there. It was sensual in the sense, well, there are the senses, but also there's so much about sensuality at the same time and especially in the Homeric hymns. So it's a combination of trying to bring it alive and try to see how these were not just static objects for the vases and static sort of songs, or, there was an anthropology around it. And the anthropology involved a very lived experience of seeing, hearing, interacting, smelling, touching. And I think that left its trace on poetry.
Another one of the major arguments of the book is that, contrary to what most people would probably assume, you don't really see the ancient Greek wedding as a rite of passage, but rather as something that is backward-looking temporally rather than forward-looking. Could you speak a little bit about what you mean by that, and this idea of female nostos? These poetics are suffused with this idea of this kind of nostos, a return to childhood. How do you see that theme figuring in?
So I approached this theme from two perspectives. One is more of a kind of a plot, let's say, perspective. By just looking at mythical sort of patterns there. And of course, you've got the bridal figures that never really make it be beyond the bride, so to speak. They remain as brides, or they never make the passage. And I think Antigone was featured very much in my mind. The other sort of thinking with modern Greek poetry and this kind of poem, this ballad of the bride who fell into misfortune, this νύφης που κακοτύχησε, that was also very important in my mind, because again, she became a wife. But when she returns, she has to return. This is a ballad about a woman who got married, was from a very rich and noble family, then fell into misfortune, we assume lost everything, and returned back to the mother. So the emphasis is on the return. And I thought, okay, this is very much a parallel sort of story with what's going on in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where we have Persephone return. So there are lots of, let's say, elements of return in so many different parts of ancient Greek literature that the passage is never really either made or even celebrated. So this is at the level of, let's say, plot, patterns that we see, and myth, and, the ingredients of most of our poetry. But then I started looking at the actual poetics, meaning the genre, and how the genre plays out, and if this is a force, so to speak, in that is present. And I think my let's say favorite sort of poem there is Sappho's fragment 114, the virginity, sort of the virginity, where will you go when you've left me, kind of. It's just 2-line fragments. And I think we may have lost kind of a tradition of the sort of lamentation of the loss of virginity and how that was envisioned, or a kind of lamentation for the fact of getting married. So that kind of told me again that we have nowhere in ancient Greek literature sort of any idealization or any romantic love in this sense. I mean, of course, if we get to the novel, things change, but in this kind of, like in the early, like I should say in the early Greek literature, we really don't have this idealization of love in this way. So we have a kind of a force that they want, the woman especially wants to return. And then I started seeing, okay, well, there's a lot about childhood, so that's why I called it kind of the ludic poetics. And I think the safe spot is the natal world. So then I started rethinking that, all these, we call it as a rite of passage in the sense that, okay, there is a gamos, there is a procession, there is a movement, it leads from point A to point B, but is that what is being celebrated? Is that what, let's say, the female voice, that to the extent that we can reconstruct it, tell us? Is that what they want? So I think it's not, actually. It's the celebration of the natal family, or a kind of, at the level of poetics, there is how to explain it better? There is a need, let's say, to be in the safe spot, and the safe spot is with the natal world.
Well, it seems like, it's yet another one of those cases where the woman, or in this case, the girl, really can't win, because either you get that bride of death sort of Antigone
right
thing, or else you get the trauma of actually getting married, of successfully getting married. And I thought that the trauma paradigm was really interesting, and I was hoping that maybe you could say a bit about how you bring that in your reading of the hymn to Demeter, because what I was struck by was how it has this very practical hermeneutic application in helping to illuminate why Persephone says some unexpected things to her mother when her mother kind of asks her what happened, and instead, of narrating, being seized by Hades and taken to the underworld or whatever, you can say it better than I.
This was another moment of these logical, let's say, disjunctions in ancient Greek literature. It was just like the Teikhoskopeia. It's like, it doesn't make sense. Okay. So this is another moment where, like, it doesn't make sense. Okay. She's just, and usually the ancient plots can be pretty good at, presenting themselves in a way that is sort of captivating, wants to get the narrator in. And suddenly, this is not what happens in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, because, Demeter finds her daughter, wants to know what happened. And this is the first time that we'll have Persephone's long sort of explanation of what happened. And instead, she interrupts and she gets into this sort of digression of the catalog of the nymphs she was with. And so, I think I've read this a million times, just going over and over again. It's just, there's a logical problem, like, why does this happen now? And I'm such a firm believer that epic poetics just have so much more, or know so much more, or understand so much more cognitively about what is going on in the mind of the speaker. And I think that's when sort of what prompted me think a little bit deeper about this scene. And then I realized, okay, she is actually buying time in the way she is interacting with her mother. She does not want to she's recovering from trauma. Something very traumatic happened, and now she has to put this traumatic sort of moment in words. So when I started looking at that, at those lines from the perspective of, let's say, the theory of trauma, it suddenly made sense. It's just like, okay, Persephone is a rape victim. She is a trauma victim, and she has to communicate all that with a difficult person that is her mother. Okay, that is her Greek mother in there. So from when I looked at it from that perspective, I thought, okay, well, that's why we have this catalog. So the catalog is not an epic performer's trick, but it really is a way to show cognitively how a speaker emerges, a speaker who has been through so much trauma and has to claim back her voice, explain what happened, but also project what she wants to do. And what she wants to do is make this trauma go away and go back to where she was.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's another version, it seems like, of that Sappho virginity, those two lines, saying, wanting to re-access the childhood. And so she's focusing on her group of other girls who are her friends and sort of, longing to return to that. And I thought it was really interesting the way that you also brought children's song into this. Could you speak a little bit about that? What sorts of sources do we have for children's songs and children's games, and how do you see those as illuminating these nuptial poetics?
We have very little about children's songs, but we do have Pollux. So we have Pollux is onomasticon, and we have, Pollux gives us a lot of descriptive elements about, ancient games and...
Could you explain the turtle game for listeners?
Yes, that's my favorite game. So I think I can read part of it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Actually, so Pollux in his 9th book, he gives different games. He describes different games, but it's interesting that one particular game sort of captures his attention, and that is the tortoise game. And as he says, well, tortoise, and I say tortoise, that's a kind of the usual translation of the Kelly Kelone. So I have a little bit of a theory there that Kelly Kelone would probably, that Kelly, maybe by Pollux's time, like catch me, that Helle. So like catch me tortoise. So there's a lot of performance that we are missing, and that may even be behind this sort of gemination of the Kelly of the first part of the word Keloni. So tortoise, what are you doing in the middle? So we have the actual rhyme, which is rare. We have very few. We have another, like the Midas game, but this gets us very much in feminine territory. So
just to explain for listeners, so there's one girl is in the middle and she's the tortoise, and she's surrounded by friends who pose these questions to her. So the first one is, tortoise, what are you doing in the middle?
And then the answer is, I am weaving a web of Milesian wool. And then so all the girls, and Pollux is very clear that it's all of them shouting back, how did your son die? And she says, he jumped from white horses into the sea. So when she says he jumped from white horses from the sea, this is a very performative moment, because she probably, this is like these little statues of one girl onto the other, or it's sort of the girls playing the ephedrismos, which is another sort of game. So she would just jump on a girl, and then the whole thing would start again, and it would be another girl that would be playing the tortoise. So we have a combination of kind of nice lyrics. We have the rhyme, and then we also have the performative element throughout. What interests me a lot with this is that we have, that psychologically, we have a lot of trauma, and in a very sort of joyful atmosphere. And I realized that not a lot of work has been done on children's songs throughout the world, because, just anywhere in the world, any culture, if you look at children's songs, they're very dark. Very difficult. The London Bridge is falling down kind of theme.
Ring Around the Rosie.
Ring Around. Yeah, they're just not an easy genre. So you have the playful sort of atmosphere and the playful performance, which is in complete disjunction with what the lyrics say if you pay attention to them. It's almost as if you are meant to not pay attention to the lyrics. And I don't think that even when we were growing up, we would know, there's some really sort of difficult sort of situations that you may sort of bring in your actual little girl song. But there's a famous sort of modern Greek, ήταν ένα μικρό καράβι, there was a little ship. And then, of course, everybody died, and there's a cannibalism that they ate each other. It's really a kind of difficult, if you think about it, you don't think about these things rationally. So that got me into thinking, so what are these songs doing and how are they present? And essentially they're negotiating trauma. They're translating sort of trauma. They're translating difficult situations to the child in a very sort of innocuous ways. It's almost a normalization kind of process that this is part of what you will go through or may have been through. And of course, it gets then you have a lot of death, you have all of that, and then this is translated into a performance that doesn't have anything to do with death. It's all playful and joyful.
The overlap too then with the wedding material is so interesting because, when one thinks of how these brides really basically were children.
Yeah. And I think this particular, the tortoise song, in my mind, it was very much together with the virginity song, because I think the virginity song was performed in the same way, because you have the same kind of duplication, like virginity, where will you go? And then we have the personification, then virginity supposedly responds, that's fragment 114 in Sappho, I'll never come back to you, I'll never come back to you. So there's again a duplication, and it can only make sense from a performance perspective if I think of it as a game, as a kind of a tag game, in very similar terms with the tortoise game.
Well, then there's another move that you make more towards the end that I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit to your really interesting interpretation then of the deception of Zeus in Iliad 14, where you touch on yet another kind of genre, or maybe a an anticipatory genre here through this lens of the nuptial poetics. Could you speak a little bit about your interpretation of what's happening in that scene?
Yeah, well, again, this is a moment of what's going on in here. Why do we have this passage here? It just doesn't make sense. So, and why do from the plot perspective, okay, Hera has a goal. She wants to deceive Zeus. She wants to give a win to her side of the Trojan War. But then she enlists the help of Aphrodite. There is the oath. It's all very, very surreal in a way. And then of course we have the meeting, the encounter of Hera and Zeus, which is also very weird. And then he will go on this male bravado. Oh, I have never been in so much in love, as I have been with you now. And so it's just,
and then he names like 20 other women he's slept with.
Yeah. And it's like, how is that supposed to make any sense here? And the only sort of way it can make sense to my mind is that if we think of it as, again, another remnant of some form of nuptial sort of performance that got into the epic there. But then the whole sort of how Aphrodite prepares Hera is also very interesting, because that's, again, very, very sexual sort of scene in many ways, and it's especially a lot of emphasis on fragrance, a lot of fragrance. It's in fact, I thought originally of putting it in my sort of senses back, but then it didn't make sense. I think it's a separate sort of genre. So when you read it from this perspective and all the sort of preparation for the sexual act, for the agency that Hera has, the network of women, of goddesses in this case, that is mobilized. So again, the anthropology of the network of women. So that kind of makes sense that I think we're looking at a tradition that we may have otherwise lost. And it just landed in Iliad 14. And that's why, from that perspective, I think it's a really early ars amatoria.
Well, I think it's just so exciting that this lens that you've taken to the material has provided some explanations for, in the course of this conversation, we covered the Teikhoskopeia, Persephone's response to Demeter's questioning, and then the deception of Zeus in Iliad 14. So you've come up with some concrete angles on these passages, which are much discussed through by deploying this perspective, which I think is really exciting. But I think one question, I guess, that kept coming to me is how your previous work on modern Greek folklore and that tradition informed your readings. And I was wondering to what extent, like, if we didn't have the modern Greek folk comparanda, do you think that we would have been able, or that you rather would have been able to pick up on these things?
I think my work on the modern Greek sort of material was more in the background, really. It doesn't show as much in either of the books, either in the, in the Voices at Work or here as much, because I think I was kind of an ethnologist at some point. I mean, I did a lot of anthropological work and sort of writing down different recording, really. So I have like all those cassettes, and I was just simply interested in how these, how people, what kind of songs made the repertoire of a village, how this is transmitted from one generation to the other. But I was also very interested in how this becomes a kind of a museum piece, so to speak. And when I did that as, let's say, an undergraduate or a young graduate student, I really had no idea about all of these oral history projects that are going on for so many, in so many different contexts. But so now, almost 20 years later, when I was revisiting this material, I was very conscious that what you kind of preserve or what you want to record in order to sort of save it as becomes its kind of its own museum piece in this sort of oral history project. So this is very much in the background for me as part of my methodology to go back to literature and see, okay, well, that's exactly what's going on. I'm looking for things that have been quote unquote preserved and have made their way, have landed into these sort of greater genres. So the modern Greek material helped me see that in action. And in particular, the song that I discussed more in my previous work, but I kind of pick back on, it really is very explicit on how the woman who fell into misfortune returns. And her mother, of course, knows that this is, her daughter. And then she sings a work song. And it is a work song that talks about her wedding. So this kind of conflation of the different genres is all together in one little song. So it's both at the level of understanding the practice, but also how these little sort of museum pieces can enrich, in a way, the greater genre.
Yeah, it's really fun. Particularly for me, I'm interested in these things sort of separately, I guess. I definitely kept thinking of Margaret Alexiou's work on the ritual lament and just how much the modern Greek archive helps.
And it's really interesting to me that, in many places around Greece, there's an attempt, today to kind of reconstruct the traditional wedding, as they call it. The paradasiakos gamos. So you have that. I've seen that in many different places, but especially in Mount Pelion, where I come from. So there's this sort of, again, it's a museum sort of way of looking at it. You want to preserve, you want to kind of recreate what you think as a traditional wedding. Okay. And there's all these elements, and then people are interestingly staged in different roles. And so it's interesting to see that they're not always conscious of what exactly is going on. So having that in my background helped me go back to literature, like the well-known literature, and see, okay, there's things that are going on that are very similar.
Well, thank you, Andromache. I was hoping that we could wrap up with the podcast word association game.
Sounds lovely. You want just one word?
Well, people don't always quite follow that
okay.
rule. So just whatever organically comes to mind first would be great. So I'll throw out some phrases and words and you can respond. The first one is eikasia. What first comes to mind?
Mirror.
Persephone.
River.
Hymenaeus.
Death.
The tortoise song.
Game.
And the ancient Greek wedding.
Festivity.
Thank you very much, Andromache, and congratulations on the really fascinating, very exciting book.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.